100% Star Wars. I haven't seen a whole heap of his stuff. I think mainly I've looked and seen what information he has on the KOTOR remake when he's talked about it. Let's see what he says when the title says, Why the Rakatan Infinite Empire Makes No Sense. This is one lock on put on, he's not here. He can get stuffed. I can wait. Let's see. Because I feel like they do make sense, especially with a lot of the references back to them throughout the timeline.
One thing that has always really bugged me about Knights of the Old Republic and the Old Republic in general is the Rakata. And that is because to me, they make absolutely no sense. Now, I want to be very clear that I love Rakatan history and Rakatan lore. It's honestly one of my favourite things about Star Wars and the entire Old Republic era. I just love this huge and completely depraved empire of force-sensitive, warmongering creatures that enslaved entire planets, created new species, and created some of the most grandest technological marvels to ever exist. But that doesn't change the fact that Star Wars most of the time just does not know what it's doing with the Infinite Empire, especially in terms of lore, and that their rise to power and their general impact on the universe is mired by constant inconsistencies. Now, one thing that I do get is that it is very hard to create a writing foundation for creatures that should essentially be the most powerful things in the universe. Not only is every single one of them teeming with the Force, they are unrivaled geniuses of technology, so of course they have to have a crux, they have to have a flaw, and that is the disease that they contract, which essentially cuts off their ability to utilize the Force, and in turn utilize their technology that utilizes the Force.
Yeah.
But this is where things start to lose consistency, and it's where it begins to stop making sense.
Okay, let's see what he says.
In case you're unaware, the Rakatans were given advanced technology by a race known as the Kwa. However, the Rakatans being the way they were, they turned on the Kwa due to a desire to conquer and destroy using the dark side, and one thing that they desperately wanted was something known as an Infinity Gate. An Infinity Gate was teleportation technology. It could move things incredible distances in an instant, and the Kwa actually built an Infinity Gate on Rakata Prime before the Rakatans turned on them. This then led to a massive war on Rakata Prime between the Kwa and the Rakatans, where many Kwa were killed, but in doing this they managed to destroy the Infinity Gate and deny the Rakatans access to their technology. The Kwa, then knowing the threat of the Rakata, basically rendered all of their Infinity Gates across the galaxy unusable. So, the Rakatans needed a new way of travelling to branch out and to conquer. So, what did they do? They built this massive, self-sustaining station above their system's star. It's quite an obscure thing in Star Wars, you've probably never heard of it, but it was known as the Star Forge.
Oh, quite an obscure thing, yeah.
The most unique piece of technology, and possibly the most powerful bit of technology ever to exist in the Star Wars universe. Using the Star Forge, they began to build an endless supply of warships, fleets, and conquest-driven weapons, so they could extend out and begin the reign of the Infinite Empire. They then created the first known hyperdrives. In Star Wars, the Rakatans are basically credited with being the first species to fully utilize hyperdrive travel, but there was supposedly a flaw in the design of these hyperdrives. The hyperdrives could only be used when channeled with the dark side of the Force. Now, as they begin to branch out and they begin to create the Infinite Empire, at the apex of their power, they managed to conquer 500 planets. You heard me right. 500. Darth Sidious's galactic empire had over 1.5 million. Are you starting to see why they don't make sense? Supposedly, their empire was so small because they couldn't travel to these other planets. They didn't have access to the hyperdrive technology that would allow them to travel to planets that weren't rich with the Force. But in comes everybody's favourite MMO, the Old Republic, and the planet Belsavis.
Right, okay, we're gonna bring in Star Wars the Old Republic. Oh boy. Here's the problem. Soldier the Old Republic has some good writing in the base game, but it still doesn't seem on the same level as other stuff because I think they prioritize it being an MMO more than it lining up with the established lore in some parts and others. So yeah, we'll see.
Belsavis is a planet in the Old Republic that is essentially a prison. The Rakatans cracked open an entire planet and locked away a Force god inside of it to stop it consuming the galaxy. They then continued to use Belsavis as like a super prison, which was known as the Tomb, and inside of the Tomb they held some of the most dangerous creatures in the galaxy. And while I said earlier that this is where things might start to get inconsistent, this is really where things stop making sense. Inside the tomb is a very, very special place known as the Eternity Vault, and this prison was designed to house a Rakatan warlord known as Soa. Soa was essentially a renegade. He
I think this is part of an operation that I was never able to play. Dagnabbit.
broke off from the Infinite Empire and went on his own. He dominated the Sith on Korriban. He used darkside alchemy to create some of the most devastating creatures imaginable, and he was regarded as one of the most dangerous beings in the galaxy. His power was so phenomenal that the Rakatans, using their entire empire, could not kill him. And much like the Force god that they locked inside of the planet, they locked Soa away in a form of stasis for eternity, hence the name Eternity Vault. The Rakatans then left behind nuggets of information to describe the Infinite Empire's bringing down of this monster, and in their description, they said that Soa alone had conquered 1,000 worlds, but the Infinite Empire, at its apex of power, could only conquer 500. Now you're telling me this makes sense. A renegade of the Infinite Empire conquered double the amount of planets than the Infinite Empire, and was then imprisoned by the Infinite Empire, who managed to beat him.
Yeah. How did they beat him would be the question.
And that's just Soa. Trust me, there's more. Also locked away on this planet were a species known as the Eshkar, or at least the surviving members of it. The Eshkar were considered to be one of the most feared species in the known galaxy. And the Eshkar, who didn't have access to hyperdrive technology in the same way that the Rakatans did, managed to conquer half the galaxy. This is legitimately the law in the Old Republic. Now, the Eshkar branched so far out that they actually began to infringe on the Infinite Empire's planetary property. This then led to a massive galactic war between the Infinite Empire and the Eshkar, which had supposedly engulfed the entire galaxy.
He's talking about things where inconsistencies he finds when talking about the Infinite Empire. Jalen.
Now, keep in mind, the Eshkar had dominated half of the galaxy. The Infinite Empire controlled 500 planets. They then had a war that spanned the entire galaxy, and the Infinite Empire won. The Eshkar had to have travel technology that allowed them to jump from planet to planet that wasn't supposedly limited by the Force, like the Rakatan hyperdrives. And they must have controlled, what, 500,000 planets? But this is the Old Republic, so let's give them the benefit of the doubt. So let's say at this point in time, only 10% of the planets in the galaxy had been discovered, in comparison to Darth Sidious's empire, so that would still be 150,000 planets. The Infinite Empire controlled 500. And the Eshkar lost the war. So, once again, I'm asking the question of you. Are you starting to see how the Rakatan Infinite Empire make no sense?
Just a moment. It make no sense. I think you could, in the end, make sense of it if, like, they had a source book or had stories later on that would explain some of these things in a satisfying way. But as of now, it feels more like SWTOR's writing isn't as good. And maybe we shouldn't go off of exactly what they say, right? Maybe even what they left had inaccuracies, especially in the translations to basic, because we know that the Rakatans did not speak basic based on Knights of the Old Republic with the star map areas, with the, especially on Dantooine, with the droids that didn't speak basic. So maybe translation errors, historical records got a bit jumbled up, and so some things could still be explained in that way, because these are things from the base game so far of SWTOR. I was thinking, like, is it going to bring up other things? Like, what is he just going to do SWTOR? Because SWTOR's already a big can of worms of stuff that, yeah, stretches things a bit. Oh, oh blasted nose. And while I didn't know about Soa, because I think that's an operation I was never able to play. Yeah. Some of the stuff is like, well, they clearly seem to add everything they wanted in to SWTOR. Ah, damn it. And it's huge. And they didn't cover every single detail just in the game. Which yeah. I want him to say something that's not from SWTOR as well. Well, there's some stuff that SWTOR came out and then the expansions were still going, so they didn't explain some of the stuff. Dang no, but hang on. Some of them in the end being inconsistencies that could be cleared up rather than literal fact for some things. Like they could have left the stuff about Soa, but that ended up being a version of it that's based on a legend that grew about them. And the number of planets is inaccurate. That's easy to do.
But wait, there's more. Locked away in the lower levels of the tomb was an incredibly powerful piece of technology that was essentially a power core. And this power core had the capability to create a hyperspace ripple that would have destroyed the entire star system. So the Rakatans had power cores that had the power capability to utilize hyperspace in the form of a weapon, but they didn't have the technological capability to use hyperspace travel without it being intrinsically connected to the dark side. And you know I'm gonna say it again, that isn't it. Remember I spoke a little bit earlier about how the Rakatans desperately wanted access to the Quas Infinity Gate technology, aka...
So you're just gonna do that and say it hasn't been thousands of years and that some modifications could have been made to the system over the thousands of years? Hey, Jalen, you found all your stuff. Goody. Yeah, you're just gonna not try and come up with some reasonable explanation yourself to make it work. And I know that we do take it as is, and that's how we should analyze some of the things. But at the same time, we're never going to get the explanations because they're not going to pay that much attention to the EU. So you're going to say that over thousands of years, something couldn't have happened that made the device usable when you're not using the Force, or like you see some Rakatans have survived that they didn't work something out at one point to adjust it.
Teleportation, but they couldn't gain access to it because the Quad destroyed all of their Infinity Gates, so they ended up having to create hyperdrive technology, which was limited by the Force. Well, across the entirety of the tomb on Belsavis, there were teleportation pads, which allowed people to teleport from one side of the planet to the other. So
Yes.
they did manage to develop teleportation technology.
I always thought the teleportation stuff was more modern though, when I was on Belsavis. Because I wouldn't expect the technology to have lasted for the thousands of years until the Republic rediscovered it and opened it back up as a prison. I guess it is in the more ancient parts of Belsavis. I haven't been there to look at the information SWTOR gives us for ages. But Belsavis is a SWTOR-only planet. Or SWTOR introduced it for the first time. So they did whatever they wanted with it, pretty much.
But let's run this back a little bit and let's summarize.
My nose
The
might be
species
sucking a
that
bit
had the
now.
technological capability to glass entire planets, to terraform entire planets, to create brand new species from scratch, manipulate the Force on a level that was never seen again, to create a machine that lasted for 20,000 years on its own, that had the ability to create material from nothing and turn that into an endless war machine, at the height of their power only managed to conquer 500 worlds due to the extremely limited nature of their hyperdrive technology. But despite their limited hyperdrive technology, they had the technological capability to crack open an entire planet, lock away a Force god who was the equivalent of the Celestials, imprison one of their own who had conquered double the amount of planets that their empire had done with the same technology, and then they go on to fight a galactic war against a species that conquered half of the known galaxy, which, as we mentioned, could be 100,000 planets at least, beat them and reduce their entire species to just under 100,000, and then locked that species away on a super prison. And then on that super prison, they created teleportation technology, which by the time of Luke Skywalker was still considered to be a myth because of how advanced it was. But they still only had 500 planets at the height of their power because of the limit of their hyperdrive technology. The Rakatan...
Also, that's short-range teleportation versus long-range teleportation, which would be a fairly big difference to point out there. The pads on Belsavis would be very short-range. The Infinity Gates would cross even maybe galaxies.
Infinite Empire make no sense. The inconsistencies of this species is ridiculous. From in-universe lore to encyclopedias to atlases, none of it makes sense.
None of it makes sense, you're saying. That is a very absolute, because I could think of it... Yes, SWTOR mucks things up, but then it mucks things up with other parts of Star Wars, and it's like, well... It's there... But take everything with a grain of salt. Like, they do have a more narrative focus on it, but obviously the writing isn't as tight as KOTOR when the Rakatans are going through all of their history as they remember it and all of that. And it's not as dedicated to that because they also have the MMO elements and they break things up into flashpoints and operations that blooming solo players can't enter, and I never got the end of the Dreadmasters or got into that other operation and all of that. Some of the stuff is like, well, we could have gotten stuff explaining the seeming inconsistency. But for me, I think it makes enough sense that short-range teleportation was there. They created hyperdrives, but all they knew how to do was like make technology that used the dark side of the Force to funnel the energy through it. Like, why keep with Force sabers if you have the technology to generate that kind of power without the dark side of the Force. That kind of thing.
When it comes to discussions about the Rakata, I am always hearing this idea that in reality they were really kind of weak because they had limited hyperdrive technology and they only managed to conquer around 500 worlds. People always say, well, Palpatine's Empire could beat them, the Sith Empire could beat them, the Republic could beat them. But if we actually look at it from the in-universe lore that's provided, nobody could beat them.
He is correct with that. Why? I've never heard these people that say the other empires and whatever could beat them. Right, well, what are these people on? Like the Rakatan Empire, the Infinite Empire, we don't even know enough about them to know if at their peak they could be beaten. Yes, they were eventually defeated because of the loss of connection to the Force and the rise of the Jedi to combat them, especially. That was a whole part of it. No, we never got the story told, but that was going to go into it, like in the Dawn of the Jedi comics. And then that wasn't even at their peak in the Dawn of the Jedi comics. I don't see how any other faction later on in the Star Wars timeline could match them apart from weak points in their use of the Force or extenuating circumstances.
The Infinite Empire was on a technological level that was never matched again in the Star Wars universe, and I personally believe that we have to ignore this idea that they had limited hyperdrive technology and that they only controlled 500 planets.
Why? Why? Why do you think it makes no sense that they only control 500 planets, right? Let's go with that. I think they could still have been more powerful and technologically advanced in so many areas, and yet the hyperdrive is where they couldn't advance quite as much. They had their branch of technology, and that's where some of the flaws were in that technology. Just saying. Also, the whole thing about cracking open the planet to... They really have that in Bell Service. So... make use of the world as a prison, Connolly. Okay. I'm just trying to think, because I don't even remember the imprisoning this Force god that's equivalent to the Celestials. It would be nice if there was a little reference to that, because it doesn't say about it in the Wikipedia page. And it'd be nice to have a bit of reference to that, okay. And he probably has more experience with that than I do, by being actually able to play the operation. Still an annoying thing that I'm like, I don't like being gated and stuff. I wonder where that information is. It would be nice if he had a reference to it. No, of course not. People don't put the references for some of them stuff anyway.
I truly believe that simply based on all of the information I have given you, that the Infinite Empire is single-handedly the most devastating...
I would assume he's correct about that because he's been correct about all the other information in the video so far. As far as just presenting the facts, and then it's his opinion of that.
...group of beings in Star Wars, but they're also treated...
They gate me because of not having friends to play SWTOR with. An operation, you need a group of 8 to play it.
The most terribly by its writers. I really want to know what you guys think in the comment section below. Let me know what you think about the Rakatan Infinite Empire. Are you a big fan of them? Are you not a big fan of them? Let me know.
Look, most of them won't even know what Star Wars. Like, there's a whole bunch. Like, one of them groups, like 2 people might know a Star Wars reference if it's from the movies. Randos I don't even know by now. And the other group's like, yeah, they're interested in other stuff.
No, because I love the Rakatans, and honestly, I'm so happy that I could finally make a video about them. And I'm really excited to hear all of your
The
opinions.
problem is they're not gamers as much that I've noticed. It's a completely different type of friend circle.
On them, because honestly, I love them so much.
At least they're cool
really
about
kind of
cosplay.
hope that other people love them as much
And
as
doing
I do,
outfits and
because
that.
they're so cool. As always, if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to hit the like button to tell YouTube that you had a fantastic time with
You
this video.
tried,
It
yeah, I
helps me
know.
out so much.
I would have mentioned doing stuff if it seemed like we had the common interest in
Also,
enough.
if you love Knights of the Old Republic, perhaps consider subscribing to join the biggest growing Knights of the Old Republic community on YouTube. I'll see you guys.
Okay, that was 3 years ago. So what I notice is a lot of his problems come from SWOTOR, which, given that the writing isn't as tight in it, is a bit of an issue, but I think that a lot of the stuff could have been explained in short stories and other things if it continued on. Yeah. SWOTOR, look, SWOTOR's one of those that I like playing solo anyway. For the narrative experience, I can take my own time with it. Whereas when you're playing with others, especially if you're voice chatting, you don't pay as much attention to the story. That's just a fact. And yeah, I wouldn't even say SWOTOR is the best Star Wars game if we're gonna play something.